The history of South Bristol, most of it is out there. It's in all sorts of books, current books, old books, but it's not focused on South Bristol. And this is just an example of some of the documents, some of the books that are available, that you can find tidbits and odds and ends that you can apply directly to South Bristol. I'm going to have a comprehensive bibliography of what I've used for this talk on the Historical Society's website sometime in the near future. And every time I look at it, I find a typo. I realize I got to put another book in there. And the history of South Bristol, like the history of anywhere, is made up of just hundreds of threads of history that come together to make a tapestry of the town. And I'm not going to talk about all those threads. What I'm going to do tonight is really kind of hit the big picture items, starting broadly, because when you talk about 500 million years ago, you really don't talk about it. It's hard to talk about South Bristol. And as we get closer and closer to the 17th century, then you'll see us coming down and see me coming down and focusing on this piece of property, this geographical piece of property. So these are the sort of major headings. We're going to talk a little bit about geology and the Ice Ages. I'm going to a little bit about Native Americans, about discovery, colonization, and then get down to the settlement of what is South Bristol and who is here and why it came to an end. Let me get rid of the first roughly 500 million years in a few slides and a quickie thing. We're going to be talking, is everybody familiar, at least fundamentally, with what continental drift means? Mm-hmm. That way back when, in the very beginning, there were little blobs of floating dry land, if you will, or continent-sized pieces that floated around and came together and separated. And if everything goes right, I'm going to show you a video here in a second with showing how these pieces flowed from about 500 million years ago to about now. It's a little short video, and I wanted to just so you can kind of follow it. This is about the opening slide, the opening of the video, and this is, I don't know if most of you can see, this says New York. I can't. Sure, I can't read that, but Los Angeles, and faintly there is a map of the United States. It's superimposed on these continents, but I put a little red star for South Bristol. So when it starts, keep your eye in there, and you'll see how South Bristol moves. This is a map with north's in the middle. The equator is right through the center, right about here. So we start with the equator. Now, give me just a second. I don't want this. I want to get out of this. We're having the usual, I've forgotten how to do this thing. Here we go. Keep your eye on New York. 250 million years ago. Coming up on 100 million years ago. 50 million years ago. Now. Everybody follow that? So I've taken care of a lot of history in one quiet. Maybe you want to see that again? It wasn't very long. Are we all square? Okay.
Yeah.
Hang on now while I get back to the slideshow. Take me one more minute. Okay. Oop, yeah. So, again, you can see that we started way back when, and we are still moving. South Bristol and is moving. What do I have? Oh, that was just a reminder of me to. Hang on, folks. I've got a little. I can do that without this. So there was the movie. We're still moving away from Europe. We're moving at about 3 inches a year, which in my lifetime will make us 20 feet further away. This map shows the yellow rock. The yellow thing is the bedrock that have the bedrock that underlies South Bristol. And when the Atlantic opened up and started to move apart, which it's still doing, forming the Atlantic Rift in the middle. Some of the piece of the continent that we were part of, a piece that was jammed onto North America, was split, and we share the same bedrock as in the yellow as most of England, Ireland, and the Netherlands, Belgium. So if you go to England and you're looking at rock outcrops, you should see essentially the same rock and the same geology that we have. And I thought that was interesting. All this moving and colliding formed, caused at the margins where these pieces kind of come together, either force the one tectonic plate under or up over the adjacent and form uplift, mountain building, which is called orogeny. And the first contact of the coast we had with another plate led to a mountain range that today you would see along the Pacific and the Alaskan coast. Very high mountains with volcanoes. And subsequently, those were all eroded down to near flat level over time. And there was a second mountain building process that caused the Appalachian Mountains that we're familiar with. But our Appalachian Mountains, the uplift was slower than the erosion of the land as it went up. As these mountain rose, they eroded down. And so while we don't have Appalachian Mountains like they do down in the south. In fact, that the other thing that happened is that miles of rock have been eroded over time. And that sort of red wavy line that you see there is about where we are today here. And the important thing about that is it shows, the brown rock, which is metamorphic rock that's been all distorted, plus some of that red and orange, which are igneous rocks, the hearts of the granites that are the hearts of volcanoes, and other igneous rocks that have been injected. You see them, Pemaquid is a great place to go and see that. And you can see some of the deformed rocks up, that rock cut up around the Walpole Church. About 200 million years ago, this part of the world started to have a series of continental glaciers. These are ice caps that completely covered the landmass. There have been at least 3 of them since they started about 200 million years ago. The last one, the Laurentide ice sheet, really left us only about 14,000 years ago. The ice over us at the maximum was somewhere between 1 mile and 2 miles of ice. And these continental glaciers acted like enormous sandpaper or plains, and they took off tremendous amounts of rock and turned it into sediment that got dumped underneath it or out into the Gulf. What is now the Gulf of Maine. The last glacier, the last continental glacier was so large that, and contained so much ice that it dropped the ocean level by about 400 feet. At the same time, the weight of the ice actually depressed the crust of the Earth by about 200 feet. So as the glacier receded, that is to say the edge melted back to the north, which started maybe 20,000 years ago and got to South Bristol about 14,000 years ago. The edge of the actual seashore was where you see the white line on this map. This is a piece of the coast of Maine where the red star. And the coastline about 13,000 years ago was much further out. We were maybe 200 feet above sea level at the time. As the ice melted, of course, the oceans rose. And also the land started to rise because the ice is unloading the land. But the ocean rose much quicker than the land rose. And so what happened was we actually went underwater. And the yellow line, which goes in well beyond Bangor and up into the Belgrade Lakes and beyond, up on the Kennebec, is the high water line. And at the time, the shorefront was up there. We had about 200 feet of water over us. And that still, and as the land continued to rise, then we came to the position we are today. The land is still reacting and rebounding from the ice unloading. And we are still moving a little bit based on that unloading sequence. We're actually, I won't get into it, but we're actually going down a little bit right now. So that's our geology in a nutshell. Almost as soon as the glacier receded from the land, and the land, the mudded muck that's at the snout of any sort of glacier finally got vegetated. Native Americans started coming onto the coastal plain. The glacier was still close by, the climate was quite cold, the land was more tundra-like than it is today. And these Native Americans were considered, called the Paleo-Indian period, and it lasted a couple thousand years. And they were primarily hunters preying on the megafauna that moved into these areas after the glacier. The mammoths, the giant sloths, those sorts of things. As the land became more vegetated, the forests came in, and I'll pass on that the forests that we have here today are very similar to the forests that grew as soon as the area started to warm up, soil had started to develop, and the only difference would be here, right here on the edge of the coast, it probably looked much like we have the spruce fir because of the effects of the hurricanes and everything that would have knocked down trees. But inland, in the interior of South Bristol, you would have been able to recognize all the tree species. They would have been, the pines and the oaks would have been much bigger. There would have been a different mix of plants, but they were pretty much the same as we have here today. And moving into that landscape were the second group of Native Americans who stayed with us some, well, what is that, 7,000 to 8,000 years. Paleo, the so-called Paleo Indian period. These were very well-adapted Native Americans. They built canoes. They were hunter-gatherers, but they were really focused on the coast. They were fishermen. They hunted whales, and they became more sophisticated. Their culture became more sophisticated. If you've heard the phrase, the red paint people, which has to do with burial rituals, these would have been, they would have been part of the, they would have been part of the Paleo Indian period. And they were here. We know they were on this land. Unfortunately, if you remember my map of where the water is, they would have been mostly further inland or out of the coastal plain that is now underwater. There really is no, of these first two Native American groups that came in, there really is no evidence of them here in South Bristol. There is offshore, but not here. And about 3,000 years ago, the last group of Native Americans came into Maine. It's called the Ceramic period. That's named because these folks were doing pots, which was different from the previous Native Americans. These folks, again, were initially hunter-gatherers, but they really weren't seagoing. They weren't going after the whales and the porpoises. They were coastal, but they migrated to the coasts in the summer and to the inland in the winter, hunting. They are the source of all the shell middens that we have in South Bristol. I have seen, Maine Preservation Commission says we have 17 shell middens in South Bristol. I know where a few of them are, but most of them are known, but their locations are kept quite carefully hidden. They're the source of the oyster shell heaps. And there are, you can find other artifacts, arrowheads and that sort of thing from these folks. So these were Algonquin speaking. That's an Indian language that covered most of the northeastern United States. The Abenaki was the name for all the tribes and families in Maine and into the Maritimes and northern New Hampshire and Vermont. And the family group that was identified as being here were Wabanaks. I know we hear the phrase Wabanaki used too, but that's a phrase that I'll come to. The actual Native American genealogy is Algonquin speaking, Abenaki, Woven. And then really the very small group of, I think, Native Americans that we need to talk about are those that were affected by the contact period. That is to say, they were here. This is the Native Americans who would have met and interacted with the European explorers and early European settlers, and suffered the consequences of that interaction. I'll talk a little more about that later. But and I've got Jody Batchelor's book up there, and if you want to know, read a very well-written description of what's going on here that is in Pemaquid. And when she talks about Pemaquid and we talk about Pemaquid, we're really talking about the peninsula, not Pemaquid Beach or Pemaquid Point. This is a great reference. Recently out, she spoke to us, what, last year? Starting with Columbus and going on really through almost 1600 was the age of exploration. Europeans, you know some of the names, Verrazano, Cabot, and they came in the New World looking for a way to get to Asia, looking for the Northwest Passage. They certainly cruised along and did some mapping of the New World, but they were not looking from a settlement point of view. They were looking to figure out how to get around this. And the only person of that ilk that might have seen South Bristol on the shoreline here is Verrazano, who was here in the late 1500s. And this is a map showing all sorts of lines of people that came here, but the only one that really is of the age of exploration is Verrazano. And you see, he went by offshore. Maybe if there wasn't a fog bank that day, he might have seen us, but he didn't come ashore. He was looking for the big rivers, and we were just along the way. Whoop! Oh, how did I get there? By 1600, the European nations were vying with each other to set up colonies in the New World. Portuguese, the Spanish in the south, the French particularly, and the English along the North American shoreline. And everybody wanted to get in on the act, including King James the First, who's the gentleman you see standing on the left. But he had a problem. France, Spain, their kings were very wealthy and could afford, as a nation, as a kingdom, to sponsor all of these settlements. But James the First was broke. He didn't have any money. He couldn't figure out how to pay to set up colonies in the New World. He just didn't have it. But he did a pretty smart thing. He captured the entrepreneurial spirit of the British population and set up something, created something called chartered a company called the Virginia Company, the Company of Virginia Adventurers. And an adventurer was essentially what we would call an investor, or stock, or someone who bought stocks. This was a joint stock. Let me back up. That overall charter, which gave a private entity the right to go and settle colonies in the New World, with the king getting a cut, of course, was subsequently split into two. There was the London Company, which was focused on investors in the London area. And then there was the Plymouth Company, which was really focus. It was focused on the Bristol, which was the big city in the west of Great Britain, where there was also a lot of entrepreneurial spirit and money. And the leader of that group was the gentleman on the right, Sir Fernando Gorges. He lived in Bristol. He was one of the leading lights of wanting to create settlements in the New World, English settlements in the New World. He was also a very successful soldier and just an all-around bigwig in the Bristol area. This is Mrs. Gorges, and I mostly included this slide because I thought, I want to know why her head is so small. But also, she is actually related to the royal line. She was a great-granddaughter of says it there. But anyway, she was Gorges's connection to the royals, and that helped an awful lot with his shenanigans. As I was saying, adventurers at the time were actually investors, and the Plymouth Company, which focused, I'll show you in a second, focused on the northern part of the eastern seaboard. Was a joint stock company, and that means that you bought a share in the company, and what you were paying for was paying for exploration of the coast of the piece of property that you had, and then underwriting settlements, sending people there to form colonies. And this is actually, this is the port in Bristol at about that time, and there was a tremendous maritime history. The big businessmen and the merchants there were very familiar with overseas, and they were risk takers. So they were excited about making a buck by settling the New World. And I mentioned, I should have shown this first, the London Company was granted the rights to settle along, well, from the Carolinas up to New York. And the Plymouth Company was given from, well, the Chesapeake up to the St. Croix River. They overlapped, but there were rules that said they couldn't be close together. And the primary focus for Gorges and that company was really New England. They didn't do a lot in that lower part. The first thing that they did was set out a number of ships to explore the coast, that is to find out what was really there. And there were half a dozen or more of these explorers that went out and did that for them over a period of 10-ish so years. The two that really have any bearing on us here in South Bristol were first Captain George Weymouth, who in 1605 came over looking to pick a place for the first settlement that the Plymouth Company would send to the New World, looking for a site for it. He landed in Winnegance, and then he, shortly after, went over and anchored the mouth of the St. George River. He went all over he went up and down the coast here, exploring from the Kennebec all the way down up the Penobscot, and then down beyond the mouth of the Kennebec. He went to the Pemaquid Indian settlement and was all over the countryside here. He certainly would have, if he didn't been here in South Bristol or went to the Ghat, or he was here. And again, Jody's book talks an awful lot about him. A couple of things that came out that were very important. One, he had an individual with him by the name of James Glaciers, who wrote a comprehensive description of the land around here, that is sitting in the boat off of Allen's Island near Port Clyde. Described the Native Americans in detail. He talked about the flora, the fauna, and it gives a tremendous insight into what here was like. They also kidnapped 5 Native Americans, which didn't sit too well with the natives. So we got this great plus of this narrative, and we got the negative of causing the Native Americans to be unhappy, which we would all pay for later on down the road. The second gentleman that came is someone we all know and love, Captain John Smith. And he came in 1614 and landed in Mohegan again, and then explored the coast and created the map that you see there. That's Captain John Smith. The other gentleman, by the way, we don't know what Weymouth looked like, but that's supposedly what he looked like. And that's Captain John Smith, and that's his map, and that's us. And he was all over the place, again, looking for a place to, that might be a colony. He liked Pemaquid. He knew that there were a lot of fishermen in the area, and he reported back glowingly on it. The one thing that Captain John Smith didn't do, he did not name Christmas Cove. I've been trying to correct that since I don't know when. He was here only in the summer. He left in the end of July. He did a lot of naming, but he named everything for important people in England. Cape Elizabeth, Cape Anne. Some of his names are still with us, but most of them are gone. Pemaquid he called Jamestown. James. But he did not. And there's nothing that says he ever was in Christmas Cove. He explored the coast, and his shipmates explored the coast. So they were around, but he did not name Christmas Cove. Just as an aside, by 1774, it was called Christmas Cove. But why and when it got its name, there's no record. I mentioned that the Plymouth Company was paying to set up settlements, explore, and then Popham, the first colony at Popham, which failed, was sponsored by the leaders of the Plymouth Company. But the other thing that they were doing was giving grants of land, of big chunks of property to investors who would then pay to pay for people to come over and to settle. Excuse me. And they would get compensated from the settlers coming over by being given more land. If they brought a family over, the investors would get, I think, 100 acres of extra land, their own land, so which they could sell. And in 1632, which was just before the Plymouth Company folded its tents and went away, disappeared, two merchants, important merchants in Bristol, Giles Eldridge and Robert Allsworth, were given what is now called the Pemaquid patent, or grant land. They had already been in Pemaquid, messing around. They had sent people over, and that's why we say that we're not sure when Pemaquid was settled. That is to say, when you could say there was a permanent settlement there. But it was in the 1625 to 1628 time frame. And they acknowledged that in the 1632 official grant or deed. And in fact, so they were granted 12,000 acres, which essentially is all of the peninsula. And parts of Damascata, Nobleborough, Wallenborough, that's about 12,000 acres. Nice little bunch of land. And they also were given, also in that grant was Mohegan and Damascata, which at the time were the sort of the focus point for fishermen. And what these guys wanted to do was, you know, make a buck by bringing settlers over, but they also wanted to charge all the fishermen who were coming into Pemaquid, because they were. And as part of the grant, it said that all the fishermen, before they went back to England, English fishermen, had to go to Pemaquid and pay. So they had a little money-making scheme there. So in 1632, they got this grant. By 1645, Thomas Eldridge's youngest son held the patent. He was his father, and Mr. Allsworth had died, and he had inherited. He actually came over here to see what's going on, and subsequently sold in 1657, sold part of the half of the land, and then eventually all of the land came into the hands of Nicholas Davis, and the Pemaquid patent was in Nicholas Davis's family in 1700. So we were all owned, if you will, then by Nicholas Davis. Not that he did anything here, but he legally held the patent. I want to digress a little bit and talk about the fisheries. The European fishermen were, by the beginning of the end of the 15th century, had pretty much exhausted the fishing stocks on the European coast. Remember that the Catholics had many meatless fish days only, and they were moving towards the New World, Iceland, Greenland, and by the late 1500s, they were fishing in the Grand Banks and Newfoundland. Eventually, they came out of the Grand Banks and came down and found that there was a winter fishery for cod, and cod was the fish. A winter fishery for cod along the coast, mid-coast of Maine, particularly in the sheepskin. The winter fishery is where the cod are spawning, and you fish for them in February and January and February and March, which I found interesting. The banks fishing was, they fish year round and they fish off of the boats. But no matter, and then the fish off the boats and pack the fish in salt barrels and take them back. But the fishery, the later fishery, particularly the fishery here in the Gulf of Maine, was that they were drying the fish. So not only did they have to come and have a place to fish, but because it was so close to the shore, they didn't have to fish out of the big vessels like we saw. They could go out day fishing, if you will, which was much more productive and probably safer. So they needed a land-based place. They needed a place to come ashore, to have some supplies, a place to sleep, and to process the fish. The fish were washed and gutted and dried. I think most of us are familiar with the process. So they needed a land-based piece of property. Excuse me, those were few and far between. They were really, they needed a shore that they could get to on the mid-coast, an area that was big enough for them to build their fish platforms and have small boats. Wingate had sort of that there. Damasco had it. They wanted to be safe from they wanted to be away from the Indians. Pemaquid had it in spades. And by 1615, there were fishing stations all over the mid-coast of Maine, particularly the Pemaquid Peninsula. Brown Pond, New Harbor, probably South Bristol, although I couldn't find an actual record. There's some hints that there was one at in what we call Christmas Cove. And because these were, the number of fishing vessels coming in were getting to be more and more. When Captain John Smith came, he reported 50 vessels, French and English fishing vessels. This is 1614. And these shore, there were plenty of fish to catch, but the shore properties were few and far between. And what the fishermen finally started doing was leaving people there, squatting on this piece of property. So when they came back to fish again in the next fall, winter season, they would have their piece of property. Now, these weren't settlements in the sense that anybody wanted to stay there forever, but they were people living here year-round. And we know they were doing it at Pemaquid, at Wingate, at Damasco, on Fisherman's Island. They probably were doing it at Christmas Cove, and maybe even on the Gut, but certainly there's a strong indication that there was a fishing station at Christmas Cove. We're getting down to some details. And this, having people around year-round, would have started more interactions with the Native Americans. Trading with the natives certainly developed pretty quickly. They've been in contact with the European explorers and fishermen since before 1600. And an active fur trade developed, principally beaver, but moose and other fur-bearing animals. And they were trading, the Native Americans were trading for European goods, clothing, metal products, knives, guns, and liquor, of course. The fishing and the trading were gold mines for the Europeans, and as we all know, they were a disaster for the Native Americans. In a very short period of time, the lives and the cultures of Native Americans, the Wabanaks here were changed radically. They became dependent on the European goods, on their food. They stopped being hunters and gatherers. They settled, rather than migrate, now they lived year-round near the trading posts, and the braves would go out and trap in the winter, trap the beaver and kill the moose, etc. in the winter, but and then come back in. They lost much of their culture. As the beaver became scarcer, there was a beaver war between tribes up and down in New England over the best trapping ground. And of course, there was the so-called virgin soil epidemics. We know that Native Americans were not immune to anything. Smallpox, measles, tuberculosis, cholera. By the 1620s, it's been estimated that 90% of the Native Americans had died, and the populations were down to just very few people. And I think I already said what this slide indicates, and that is to say that the fishermen and started to form settlements, and colonization focused on these points. Eventually, the Plymouth Company looked at these fishing sites and said that, these are good places to, they've got some infrastructure going there. They're doing things that are not just fishing, farming and this and that and the other. And so that's a good place to focus on setting up colonies. I think that's why Plymouth was a big deal. There weren't many more big. Popham Colony, which came earlier, was in an area where there were natives and fishing stations. So we don't know exactly when South Bristol would have had its first settlers, but certainly it would have been in the 1630s, something like that. I'm comfortable saying in the 1630s we were settlement in the same way there were settlements in New Harbor and Brown Pond and in Boothbay. These were really, these were really part of the Pemaquid settlement, outlying farms, little satellite fishing. And there were really only east of the Kennebec, in what is now called Saginaw. There were only 3 major settlements. There was, early on, there was, I've forgotten the name of my notes. There was a settlement on a Rousick near the Kennebec. There was sort of a sheepskin settlement, and then Pemaquid. And Pemaquid was the northernmost settlement of the English New World. Now you notice I haven't talked about the history of Bristol, Pemaquid, and all the interaction we had with the French. I'm focusing on South Bristol, and now we're there. There isn't anywhere where you can find a written history that covers everything there is to know about South Bristol between 1600 and 1700. I had to dig and look hard and long to identify people and names that were here. It's out there, but you have to pull it together. And this really is sort of the summary. There were settlements there were some people up on the upper Damariscotta, but it appears they are all on the west side. It appears. It's difficult to know. Here, this area was called Coburn, the Coburn Gut. And Coburn Sound, which was the Gut Sound in those days, meant the same sort of thing as what we say is the Gut today, a narrow passage. And there are two possible people associated with the name Coburn Gut that you guess if it's called that, that means they own land here, they might have lived here, but we don't know for sure. John, there was a John and a Robert, both of them were captains of fishing and trading vessels in the 1630s. Somewhere along the way, the gut got called Two Bacon. It's spelled just as there was a Two Bacon marsh up the river, Two Bacon rocks up the river. Whether that's somebody has a name, Two Bacon, or whether that's some sort of Indian, name, I don't know. But that was referred to. There was a fishing settlement called Winnegance, and it's not crystal clear, but I'll show you the tidbit that makes me think it is. This is probably the fishing station in Christmas Cove. Who Winnegance was, there are widgeons kicking around New England in that period, but which one it was, there's just no way of knowing. We know there were, it was called Holmes Island. We know also that during that period it was referred to as Ball's Island. We know that there were at least 2 farms on the island, so possibly this is Mr. Holmes and Mr. Ball living there. Again, we don't know for sure, but it hints at something. And then we know about a man and a woman by the name of Buckland. George Buckland and Elizabeth Buckland, who was his wife. We know a lot about him. And anybody that's done any looking at back in that period knows that Buckland, the spellings of last names are all over the place. And I've just listed several that were associated with George Buckland, and that I know is this George Buckland. There was an Elihu Gunnison that was here, and a man by the name of John Butler. And I'll come to those guys, but let's talk about the Bucklands. You know a lot about the Bucklands. George was born in England, or maybe probably the Isle of Wight, if not then in the Bristol area, about 1630, 1620. There are several Bucklands that came to the New World in around 1630 during what's called the Great Migration. I think that this is the family that George was part of. There were several Georges, but these folks came to Salem, Massachusetts, and ultimately George Buckland went back to Salem, Massachusetts. There is a Richard Buckland that's on Wingate at the same time George is here, and several others, and also in the Wells Kittery area where George was, there was a Richard Buckland. So again, I can't absolutely say for sure that this is his family coming to the New World, but it looks pretty good to me. We know he was married to Elizabeth, about 1640. We don't know Elizabeth's last name. We know he had at least one child. I'm very comfortable saying that around 1643 he was living at the and owned property and was living probably at the mouth of the Kennebunk River. The significance of that is that this was Fernando Gorges's property. Fernando Gorges wound up owning Maine, which was the land that stretched from the Scattergoss River up to the Kennebec. He gave himself one of the grants, and he called it Maine. And this is his country. And there are a lot of bucklands associated with Bristol, with the people that hold the Pemaquid patent, Aldrich and Elbridge, anyway, and Fernando Gorges. So it's not surprising that you see other people's names, surnames that are clearly associated with the Bristol area. So they're bringing people they know over. I mean, that makes sense. He was living on Coburn Sound before 1647. He had purchased 2 farms and the neck of land that runs from about the S Road down to the gut. And it got the name Buckland's Neck. Nice piece of property. In 1647, he shipped fish from Pemaquid. There's a record of that. And in fact, Elizabeth also had produce being shipped. It doesn't say what hers were, but you would assume it might be woven material or something. But she's also listed as sending something to England to be sold by a man who was going back and forth. In 1651 at Casco Bay, he witnessed a promissory note between Thomas Elbridge, recognized that name, and a member of John Cleves, who was the first settler of the Casco Bay area. In 1664, when the political picture shifted from Saginaw being sort of a free-for-all place, sort of under Massachusetts Bay thumb, and became a direct, for a little while, became directly under the king of, under the royal, King Charles, who actually had given it to his brother, who was at the time James, and became King James II. He took an oath of allegiance to the king. In 1665, there's a notation where he is considered one of the big landowners in the area, which makes him a player. There were 400 or 500 people living in the area at the time. He's a big player there. He's reported to be a fisherman and a planter. Again, living on Buckland's Neck, about in 1670, you can see he owns 2 farms. He owns salt marshes, which are very important to him. On Damasco and up near Butter and Cheese Island. Anybody know where Butter and Cheese Island is? Well, if you go up the river on the west side, above where the Darling Center is, there's the river next down. If you've ever been, there's an island, first kind of island on your left as you go upriver. That was Butter and Cheese, and behind that is a well-known wetland, a salt marsh, because salt marshes were very important It's clear that, that he must have been a fisherman, we know that, and he had a farm, and we'll see in a minute some other things that he was. So he was farming, probably exporting cattle to Boston, because that was a thing everybody was doing here. Subsistence farming, probably had some sheep, and he was fishing. He could fish in the off-season. He could farm in the summer, cut timber, logs, firewood in the summer, and fish in the winter fishery. He had and it's a little out of sequence, he also had a tavern. And a tavern in those days he would have been allowed to sell liquor, but he also would have had, be able to put up strangers, which was a special thing. Again, we'll see about that in this next thing. And based on what I've read about the sorts of places that these scattered settlers were living, it's probably likely, and I don't say this because I live on Shipyard Road, but it's probably likely that he was living and his buildings were probably on the west side, Shipyard Road area. And that's, it had a shore, you could come ashore to, it was sheltered, he was on the passage, where everybody was going back and forth. They'd go through the Sound, and he wanted to face south to get the sun. He wanted to be able to look down the river and see what was going on. So again, it's a guess on my part, but I think it's a pretty good one, that he was living on the somewhere along Shipyard Road, probably right under my house, I'm sure. Okay, and now we come to probably the most interesting thing, interesting source of information, and I'm running a little long, but I'll keep going. We're almost over with here. In 1667, he gave a deposition in a lawsuit between a man named Walden and a man named Smith. Walden, Smith, and a third person, partner, got together to do to send a boat trading up into maritime Canada, to St. John. Maybe a little under the radar, but, and Smith provided the boat, and Walden provided the money, and the third person provided the goods to pay for this excursion. And coming back, Smith and his boat was wrecked somewhere around Mount Desert. They went ashore, they burnt the boat, and he and the rest of the crew were guided back down to Mr. Buckland's tavern, where he spent the rest of the winter, because this was in the wintertime. And when he finally got back to Boston, Walden was pretty upset, because he claimed that Smith had wasted money and crashed the, and there was a big lawsuit, and so they took depositions from all sorts of people trying to sort this out. And one of the people who was deposed was George Buckland. So Smith stayed at Buckland's tavern, and Buckland helped Smith go out to Fisherman's Island and borrow or rent a boat. And as they were coming back up the river, they met another boat that offered Smith a free ride home, but he refused that. So instead, Buckland rigged the boat for Smith, who went on his merry way back, and crew back there. And he was Buckland was paid, was given a moose hide in payment for all this work, keeping these people through several months, feeding them and probably giving them something to drink. They didn't have anything. And he says, no, he got a moose hide, but they still owe him money. And so this gives you a lot, this validates a lot of other things that you see. I mean, he knew boats. I mean, he knew boats anyway, but he had the wherewithal to rig it. He had a tavern. There must have been enough people around to hear to make it worthwhile to be that. And I have a photocopy of the actual written deposition. Just to make another point, in 1764, he was, well, you can read that. He was allowed to have a tavern. Legally, he had to be appointed to have this public house. And also in 1774, Massachusetts Bay Colony took over the governing of Saginaw, and he now swears allegiance to the Massachusetts Bay Company, you know. And in 1776, and we're getting close to the end here, he abandoned Coburn Sound just before a Native American attack and went to Salem. And the last we hear of him, he was in a lawsuit he was a plaintiff in a lawsuit in Salem over money owed them from a fishing trip. And he probably died in sometime before 1786. I don't have the exact dates, but here's why I think that. Eliot Gunnison was from Kittery. He was an important player in Kittery. His father was a selectman and a major figure in Kittery, in the Kittery area. He was ultimately was a selectman, and he owned a lot of property, and he was a shipbuilder. And in addition, he was a soldier. And we know in the early 1680s, he was living in the Pemaquid area. His name shows up in a number of documents. He was granted by the authorities the Buckland property. The deed description describes the same property as actually we know from other sources. Whether he lived there or not, lived here or not, I don't know. But he certainly owned it. And he was probably given that grant for services rendered during one of the previous Native American attacks. Particularly, he did good work in the Scarborough area as an officer. So probably this was his reward. Probably he was interested in it for the timber. Again, he was a shipbuilder. We know he built ships up here. And whether he lived here or not on the ground, he did own it. And in fact, just before the end of the 17th century, he sold half of it to Willie Pepperell, who was also of Kittery and that area. What happened to his deeds, we don't know. After 1700, everything vanishes in terms of our friend Eliot. The last person I just want to speak about briefly is John Butler. I have no idea who John Butler is, but in right after 1700, he claims by execution, which means he has a deed, probably from Buckland, for the same piece of property. And his claim was denied. But that's how we know that Buckland had salt marshes and farms. In 1775, in Massachusetts, Wampanoag Indian tribe rose up against the English settlers. Probably what is the bloodiest war fought in terms of per capita deaths fought in the history of America, North America, of the United States. That war spilled over into Maine in 1676. Why do I say 1676? It really wasn't King Philip's war. That is to say, King Philip was dead by then, before this. But it was the same reasons that Native Americans had just had enough. They had suffered through almost half a century of abuse, disease, and they took it into their hands to fight back. They recovered and they attacked many settlements. And in 1776, Wabanaki, which was a combination of a number of tribes that gathered together to attack. The Wabanaki tribe or group attacked settlements along the coast of Maine. One of the first ones was the settlement at Rumsey, and that was pretty devastating. A lot of people were killed, but the word got out that to Sheepscot and to Pemaquid that the Indians were on the warpath, and they got out, they left. Sheepscot was attacked and burned, but nobody lost their lives. And Coburn Sound was attacked. They all somehow managed to get into boats and were headed out to Dameras Cove and to Mohegan finally, and then on to Massachusetts. I've abbreviated it, but that's a report of what they did. As they sailed away, they saw Pemaquid, Coburn, Wiggins burning. And I looked high and low, and that's the only photograph I can find of that. All right, okay, but that's what, and that marks the end of settlement in South Bristol. Pemaquid and the forts go on. There are more Indians, more fighting. The forts are built and torn down, but no one lives here after 1776. In fact, when settlers do come, they are required to live within, I forget how close to a fort, and there were no forts here. They did come back and they lived in Pemaquid, and there was a fort, and you know the rest of that story. But that marks the end, and it isn't until 1729, 1730, almost, well, more than 50 years before people come back here. They come to Pemaquid, but they're here too, quite quickly, and settle. And we had a little long, folks, I apologize, but that's the story.
So quick question.
Oh, no, all right, go ahead. Yeah.
who came back and why did they come back?
Well, that's a whole completely different thing. That's the story of the Dunbar settlements. And I'd be glad to tell that story some other time. But it's a whole different story.
Yeah.
It's completely different. Other than I won't get into it. It's but again, that story is told by a number of people quite well. Barbara Rumsey in her Colonial history, Colonial Boothbay tells that story. There's a Chuck Rand, there's a notebook in the library of Chuck Rand, who was formerly co-president of the Boothbay, the Old Bristol Historical Society, did his doctoral work on Dunbar, and it's talked about in many places, so you can dig that up. But it's an interesting. Maybe we'll get Chuck to tell the story. Question over there.
I read that before the permanent settlement at Pemaquid, there were 2 other settlements that the Indians had wiped out. Before that, is that true? There was a settlement, Indians wiped them out, another settlement while they were wiped out, and then in 1630 or whatever.
No, the Native American, you probably confused, well, there were settlements at Pemaquid that were wiped out twice in a row, but that's post 1676. The settlement, there really was no serious problems in Maine or on the coast with Native Americans through most of this period. When, by 1630, they weren't. They were gone. And what came back in, they were still trading. There were, all sorts of friendships. They all lived quite amicably until the Europeans just started to become more and more, and it was clear what was happening. And the Native Americans got wiser and more, and finally just couldn't take them. But there were 2 after the abandonment of Pemaquid. Then there were 2 more episodes of attacks. The forts were built. There was a little fort there, but the forts were built, the ones we know about today, and there were attacks, and then they were all abandoned. And by 1690, in the mid-1690s, there was nobody there. The coast of Maine, except for Kittery, I think, was totally devoid of English settlers at about before 1700.
Another question. When I have guests up here, I didn't tell them John Smith named Christmas Cove. Who did?
We don't know. I don't know. I'll tell you, I've looked very carefully because that story shows up in advertisements for the hotels and publicity. I can't find anything, that story, I can't find it in any records before really the hotel periods and all that. But he didn't. It's clear that he didn't. And there's no. It wasn't called it, but somebody named it before the latter part of the 18th century. But why? I don't know. There are a lot of names that names of places.
So it stuck after the latter part of the 18th century, Christmas Cove, the name?
Yeah, there's a very famous British naval map that has Christmas Cove on it, and it was published in 1775, and the mapping was done in 73, 74. So, and some of the names that we have here in town date from that period. Some of them go back back to this period. Winnegate, Pemaquid, but Coburn Sound just didn't cut it, apparently. So, any other questions? Well, thank you very much for